She stood at the edge of the grave with dirt still under her nails and rain carving paths down the collar of her coat, and one sentence from a man with a leather briefcase reshaped the map of her life. The lawyer had said it quietly, as if naming an illness, not an empire. There is a trust and a commercial portfolio valued at roughly $500 million. For a few breaths, the world shrank to that number, and to the face of the man who had not come to the funeral, the man who had texted that he was too ill to travel, and whose message now felt like an echo in an empty chapel. The grass smelled of wet earth and plastic floral wrap. Cups of cheap coffee had left a bitter residue on the coffin lid, and the distant rumble of a bus passing through town made the moment feel both intimate and ridiculous. The lawyer rolled one page, then another, as if opening a series of small boxes. He mentioned properties bought in downturns, leases renewed through decades, a trust deliberately obscure, and an executrix who was nameless to most of the family. Emily thought immediately of her husband and the faltering company he ran, of payrolls late for 2 months, of suppliers who had stopped answering. Maybe $500 million would be salvation. Maybe it would be a blade. A choice manifested like a coin spinning in the rain. Save the failing empire and stay with the man who had increasingly lived as if the world revolved around his convenience? Or keep the secret close, learn the shape of the inheritance, and decide whether to wield it as protection or punishment. The promise in the lawyer's soft voice was plain. What came next would not be merely about money. It would unmake and remake what she believed about loyalty and power. What you will hear is the story of that choice and the slow, precise strategy that followed. Emily had grown up with thrift store toys and a mother who taught her to count coupons like scripture. As a child, she watched her mother patch shoes and stitch hemming while humming names of streets and buildings as if reciting a ledger. They moved through apartments with scuffed linoleum and the smell of tomato sauce, and her mother, Margot, worked late nights as a receptionist and learned real estate by listening to men at the diner. Emily learned early that endurance was a skill, and numbers could be a map. She earned, scholarship by scholarship, a degree in urban studies, and years later used that training to run a modest nonprofit that helped tenants understand leases. Her mother taught her to build trust out of small, honest trades and to respect the quiet accumulation of assets. The last 10 years had been thinner. Margot's health worsened, and Emily's husband, Alexander Lang, a self-styled entrepreneur who had risen quickly in Silicon-adjacent ventures, promised to help, but instead pulled away into longer trips and later texted that stress or illness kept him distant. After Margot's death, Emily found herself both grief-stricken and oddly relieved by the clarity the lawyer's folder offered. In the space between a mother's casket and the sealed office door, she realized the past had quietly built a future that almost no one had known. That revelation tied directly to the choices she had to make now. Protect a marriage fraying from absence and secrets, or use the resources to create a different kind of legacy. Her backstory was not one of entitlement, but of accumulation by careful, often hidden work. That history would shape every move in the months that followed. The lawyer, Martin Hale, explained the structure in a way that felt both dry and intimate. He was mid-50s, gray at the temples, precise with a fountain pen, and careful with names. He said the trust had been structured as an irrevocable trust with a corporate sleeve, a holding company layered over a series of LLCs and special purpose entities, each owning parcels, retail centers, and office blocks across 3 states. The term irrevocable carried weight. The trust had been intentionally designed to limit direct access and to protect assets from creditors or marital claims if certain conditions were met. As Martin spoke, Emily felt the technical terms like light entering a darkened room, sudden and revealing. He described a named executrix who had power to direct distributions and an advisory board who met rarely. He produced a binded inventory, a map of properties with addresses and assessed values, a ledger of rental income and loan amortizations. He mentioned a side agreement, a confidentiality clause, and a plan that used a corporate veil for anonymity in case of auctions. Each term landed with the click of a stamp. Emily listened, smelled the leather and paper and the faint perfume of the man who sat opposite her, and thought about the phone in her coat pocket. She imagined a simple phone call that could save Alexander's company, or a single tap that could expose his duplicity. The choice remained cruelly clean: disclose and possibly become the instrument of his recovery, or withhold to discover what he had truly done, and, if necessary, wield the inheritance to achieve a different kind of justice. She discovered the first proof of betrayal on a Tuesday evening. The ring of her phone in the dark kitchen had been a small, clinical sound, and the voicemail icon pulsed a steady red. She pressed play. There were 10 seconds of static, then Alexander's voice. "I will be back in time for the meeting." A laugh followed, light, familiar, and then a woman's voice in the background, soft and clear, answering with his name. Emily sat on the counter, her fingers touching the cool ceramic, the taste of stale coffee in her mouth, and the sound of that laugh seemed to unthread years. She listened again, slowing the hearing breaths, clinking glass, a faint perfume described in a text she found later as lilac and citrus. She searched his phone while he was away, messages hidden in app archives, a string of dates and locations that did not match his itinerary. The kitchen lights buzzed. Outside, a delivery truck idled. The smell of frying oil from a neighbor's window crept in. What began as curiosity became methodical collection. She copied messages, screenshot receipts, and stored voice notes in encrypted folders. The first scene of betrayal had the intimacy of a murmured confession, but the scale of a public collapse. She could feel, in that kitchen lit by a single bulb, the solidness of proof gathering like rainwater in a basin. When she went to Sophia Ruiz, the private investigator, the conversation had the rhythm of an interrogation turned gentle. Sophia was small, efficient, with a navy jacket and a lanyard of keys. "You want verification or vengeance?" she asked, and her voice was a scalpel. Their exchange stretched long, a measured duet of questions and clarifications. "I want the truth," Emily said. "I want to know how much he knew, who else is involved, and if any of that touches the trust." Sophia hummed softly. "There are ways to trace money and to find paper trails behind corporate veils. I will need access to his schedules, emails, and bank narratives." They negotiated confidentiality, payment milestones, and a method for transmitting evidence to avoid alerting Alexander. Sophia promised discreet surveillance, an audit of his corporate travel, and a chain of custody for all materials she recovered. The smell of rain persisted. Sophia's coffee left an oily ring on the table. Emily's palms felt clammy. In the following days, Sophia delivered a report that unfolded like a map. Dinner reservations, hotel folios, a series of transfers to an account under an LLC that bore a name matching one of the trust entities. The PI's photographs showed Alexander entering a hotel with a woman whose face did not appear in the family albums. The evidence grew methodically, and for the first time, Emily began to imagine a plan beyond grief and suspicion. The collection of evidence became a ritual and a science. In a small, windowless room, they set up a temporary archive: a laptop with encrypted drives, a scanner, labeled folders, and a whiteboard with timelines. Daniel Park, a forensic accountant, joined the team. He was lean, wore wire-rimmed glasses, and had the habit of tapping a pencil as if counting invisible columns. Daniel traced cash flows back through shell companies, reconciled bank statements, and mapped rent rolls against suspicious transfers. He explained how a trust could shield assets but could also leave breadcrumbs if payments were made to operational accounts or if reimbursements were recorded improperly. The technical explanation of forensic tracing was precise. Look for round number transfers, rapid movement between LLCs, and payments to vendors who were actually front companies. He recommended subpoenaing certain documents, records, and outlined the mechanics of an audit. That paragraph of procedure ran in plain language. Subpoenas require cause and must be filed with supporting affidavits.
An audit of a privately held company begins with an inventory, ledger reconciliation, and forensic sampling. Chain of custody must be preserved to ensure admissibility in court. Each night the archive smelled faintly of toner and coffee, and the hum of a hard drive spinning was a constant companion. Photographs were printed and pinned, texts transcribed line by line, hotel folios highlighted, receipts stacked and labeled. The process felt surgical, disciplined, and painfully slow. The plan with Martin Hale unfolded in a conference room with glass walls and a view of cold city blocks. Martin suggested a three-part strategy: secure the trust's immediate oversight, create a defensive corporate structure that could act as a discreet purchaser if necessary, and prepare a legal challenge to any marital claim Alexander might assert. They spoke of forming a new LLC to participate in any auction anonymously, of obtaining court orders to freeze suspicious transfers, and of using a combination of probate petitions and creditor notices to force transparency. Their dialogue ran long and precise, each line containing no fewer than 10 exchanges as they debated merits and contours. If we petition the probate court, what is the quickest route to compel production of documents? Emily asked. A petition for an accounting, Martin replied. We can file under the inventory and demand the trust accounting within 30 days. If we have probable cause that assets were diverted, we attach a motion for temporary restraining order. And the LLC? Emily pressed. We form an entity with nominee managers to bid at an auction or to acquire assets quietly, Martin said. We need to ensure the LLC is capitalized, that the source of funds is defensible, and that we are not exposing the trust to claims of collusion. They discussed confidentiality, the ethics of anonymity, and the procedure for a blind purchase at a trustee-led sale. Each exchange was laden with the vocabulary of trusts, portfolios, executresses, and penury. Outside, the air smelled of exhaust and paper mills, and inside the room a clock ticked over heavily. They created a milestone calendar. Day 10, file petition. Day 20, service of notice. Day 30, injunction motion if discrepancies found. The plan read like a ledger where every line had consequence. She performed normality with a rigor that surprised even her. At dinners, she smiled and listened. At board meetings, she kept minutes, and at charity galas, she raised bids as if nothing in her life had shattered. Alexander, for his part, continued to drift through the social orbit like an island of charm that left small hurricanes in his wake. Emily scheduled conversations with him that were careful and controlled, asking about the company and about his trips with the kind of small questions that were meant to elicit facts without arousing suspicion. Their dialogues in these domestic performances
Were a study in restraint and manipulation. At dinner one night, they traded 10 exchanges that read like a duet where truth hid in the rests. "Did you ever talk to my mother about investing?" Emily asked. "Of course," he said. "Margot was charming." She pressed. "When?" "Years ago," he said, "before we met." She asked about invoices and a supplier he mentioned, and he smiled, shifting, answering with a joke, deflecting. In the quiet of their bedroom, she kept receipts hidden in a book and listened to the soft, mechanical breath of his sleep. Sensory details accumulated: the clang of silverware during staged meals, the citrusy scent of Alexander's cologne, now familiar and now suspicious, the rough texture of a checkbook she had once shared and now reviewed alone. Her performance was a long experiment in patience and observation, a stage on which she collected small confessions and gauged reactions. At the charity dinner where Alexander was expected to speak, she planted seeds. In conversation with Eleanor Grant, a trustee from one of Margot's past investments and now a named advisor in the trust, Emily asked casual but pointed questions about meeting minutes and board confirmations. Eleanor, dignified and discreet, replied with practice and pause, but showed signs of unease. There were 10 to 12 exchanges with Eleanor, each calibrated to reveal small inconsistencies. The gala smelled of perfume, candle wax, and wine. The clink of glasses punctuated assertions. The low hum of a string quartet made private words feel exposed. Emily collected Eleanor's offhand references to an advisory meeting that didn't show on calendars, and a distribution that had been deferred for strategic patience.
She filed this new information with Daniel's ledger and Sophia's photographs. The night was a performance and a harvest. Smiles, applause, a sealed envelope slid under a table with a notation on a napkin. These social scenes were not frivolous. They were the architecture of influence. As the evidence solidified, vendors began to call with blunt demands. Suppliers to Alexander's company threatened lien filings. Payroll bounced, and creditors mailed certified letters with phrases like "notice of default" and "intent to levy." The detail of a creditor's demand requires clarity. A lien begins with notice, proceeds through filing a claim with county records, and can result in execution if left unopposed. The legal machinery of creditor claims meant that Alexander's corporate entity was vulnerable, and that a well-timed injunction could halt some actions. Emily and Martin used this dynamic to accelerate filings that would protect the trust while allowing them to nudge the company toward public collapse if needed. The sequence was coldly efficient. File for accounting, obtain temporary restraining orders on suspect transfers, form the anonymous LLC, and prepare to bid at any sale that liquidated key assets. The collapse arrived with the quickness of a bank notice and the noise of a public sale. Alexander's primary venture, once a darling of private capital, defaulted on a tranche of debt after a court sided with a creditor who proved irregular payments and undisclosed guarantees. Notices from the trustee arrived in envelopes that smelled faintly of ink and legal glue. Their pages listed failed covenants, a failure to maintain liquidity, and an upcoming foreclosure sale. Emily watched the company disintegrate like paper and water while keeping her voice even in public. The auction notice read like a script: time, place, list of assets, minimum bids, and the ability for third parties to participate through assignment. They decided to have the LLC bid anonymously. It required funding, bank guarantees, and a proof of funds statement that would survive scrutiny. Daniel prepared a certified statement, and Martin arranged bank letters confirming capital. The LLC was formed with nominee managers and a third-party trustee to protect Emily's identity. The plan was legal and precise: acquire critical assets at auction to control future revenue streams and preserve Margot's vision for community investment. They would not be buying everything, only pieces that mattered to local tenants and to the capacity to relaunch a public-facing project. The auction itself was a study in ritual and pressure. The room smelled of old coffee, antiseptic, and printed catalogs. The auctioneer's gavel rasped. Bidders rustled paddles. Phones buzzed with live streams. Emily sat in the back, a scarf pulled up, the texture of the program pressed to her palm. Daniel and Martin were near the front for tactical reasons. The bidding on the property that would anchor the trust's local income started slow and then accelerated as hedge funds tested the market. There were multiple tense exchanges between proxy bidders and the auctioneer where strategy was revealed and masked. At one point, a rival bidder increased in round numbers that suggested institutional funds. Daniel countered by escalating in small, tactical raises meant to exhaust the other party. Sophia kept her camera trained. The auction ended with the gavel fall on a price that was both higher than expected and within the parameters they had set. The LLC emerged as buyer, anonymous but effective. There was a technical description of transfer of title. After the hammer falls, the successful bidder signs a purchase memorandum, deposits the earnest money, and the trustee records the deed upon full payment or as directed by the sale terms. Emily felt the enormity of that signature more than the ink. News of the auction and the sudden acquisition leaked in a way that felt predictable. A local reporter named Marta Cole wrote a piece about a mysterious buyer saving a local mall from redevelopment. The article smelled of deadline coffee and street-level detail. It quoted a lender and a tenant and used words like unexpected purchaser and anonymity. The press attention unwound Alexander's neat narrative like a thread. In the face of public exposure and private financial ruin, his allies thinned. A creditor named Tom Barrett, an auctioneer turned asset manager, called to discuss settlement options, and his voice sounded like the scrape of paper. Peers had once deferred to Alexander's charm, now spoke in the flat tones of ledgers. Emily observed the erosion with a dry mixture of sorrow and resolve. The company that once supported 10 storefronts now had 6 shuttered. The ripple effects were practical. Employees filed for unemployment, suppliers sought accounts receivable, and community programs feared loss of funding. She had not intended to punish innocents. Her plan had always included a social safety net in the aftermath. When the marriage unraveled into formal separation, it did so in the language of law and in an office that smelled of lemon polish and heated air. Alexander retained a high-profile divorce attorney named Raymond Ellis, who was brusque and polished like a minted coin. There was an early negotiation with 10 to 12 exchanges across multiple sessions about spousal support and the characterization of assets. Martin counseled Emily on protecting trust assets from marital claim with precise legal terms. He explained the difference between community property claims and separate property, the function of a prenuptial or lack thereof, and how an irrevocable trust can limit equitable division if funding and intent are properly documented. He proposed filing a declaratory judgment to clarify that the trust assets were not marital property subject to division. The courtroom was a public space with a carpeted smell and the faint rustle of spectators' programs. Emily watched Alexander attempt a last-minute settlement offer that was more about pride than fairness. The judge set a schedule for discovery that would take months, sealing certain documents and ordering others produced. In hearings that mixed legalese with human humiliation, Alexander found his reputation eroded in factual reports and in depositions where his nonchalance contrasted with documentary evidence. The narrative arc of divorce in court is procedural: motions, discovery, depositions, settlement conferences, and, failing agreement, trial. Each stage peeled back the veneer. There were moments of acute tension that compressed the narrative into small, sharp scenes. The first moment was the day a creditor's representative arrived at the nonprofit's office with a levy notice. Emily had to explain to staff why payroll would be delayed while she kept her voice steady and the smell of printer toner strong. The second was the night she confronted Alexander with the compiled evidence and he offered a story that crumbled under the weight of recorded receipts and hotel folios. The third was the auction day, when the paddle numbers climbed and her heart hammered as the gavel hovered in the air. Each of these moments stretched into paragraphs of their own weight. The levy was a soundscape of staplers and hushed questions. The confrontation, a back and forth of denials and soft admissions. And the auction, a crescendo of voices and strategy. In private, she revisited the voicemail with the laugh and the woman's voice until the sound became a motif that echoed under every legal filing. She also named and mobilized allies. Aside from Martin and Sophia and Daniel, Aisha Reynolds,
longtime friend and director at a local tenants' rights group, coordinated outreach to tenants affected by store closures. Luca Moreno, a community development director, helped map possibilities for converting purchased properties into mixed-use spaces with nonprofit leases. Tom Barrett, the auctioneer and now asset manager for certain portfolios, provided procedural clarity about timing and transfer, but had no knowledge of Emily's identity as the purchaser. Each person played a role that was concrete. Aisha organized emergency grants for displaced workers. Sophia secured surveillance logs and a hotel folio that was admissible as evidence. Daniel certified forensic reports that could be used in court. Eleanor Grant's subtle revelations helped to confirm dates. Marta Cole wrote a public piece that shifted local perception. These named secondary characters acted as the supporting cast that carried forward the technical and human sides of Emily's plan. About one-third into this story, we reach a moral hinge and a moment for you to weigh in. If you were standing where Emily stood, with a $500 million trust in your hand and a partner who had been absent and deceptive, what would you do? Would you use the inheritance to save the marriage and the company? Or would you protect the assets and direct them towards something larger than personal reconciliation? Pause and reflect on how anger, duty, and grief might color your choice. If you were to comment now, write exactly "I would help" or "I would refuse," and add one short sentence explaining why. Your responses matter because they shape how people in similar situations feel seen and understood.
Honest comments can be a lifeline to someone navigating betrayal or financial collapse. After you post your thought, return to the story to learn how Emily turned private discovery into public consequence. The legal reckoning escalated through depositions and a crucial forensic audit. In a 280-character technical summary, a forensic audit examines account ledgers, traces suspicious transactions, tests the reliability of internal controls, and produces a sampling-based report explaining whether assets were misapplied. The auditor's role included reconciling rent rolls to bank accounts, comparing vendor invoices to payments, and flagging round-figure transfers typical of shell company movements. Daniel produced a clear audit that showed payments from Alexander's operating company routed through an LLC with a name matching one in Margot's trust portfolio. That finding led to a court-ordered production of certain trust records and to a judge's temporary restraining order preventing the sale of key assets pending further review. The technical procedure was precise and dry, but the effect was seismic. In mediation and in private conferences with Raymond Ellis, negotiations turned to the language of settlement. Alexander proposed an agreement that would have him retain executive control of certain assets in exchange for a token transfer to Emily. She declined. The negotiations included many quiet exchanges where pride and fear fought. At one point, Raymond leaned forward and said, "You will lose if."
We drag this into a full trial, and Emily, remembering her mother's thrift and stubbornness, replied, "Then let the truth stand in court." Depositions revealed patterns of concealment and frivolous transfers. The judge criticized both parties for the public spectacle, but granted Emily protection for the trust assets, noting the irrevocable terms and Margot's documented intent to keep certain properties outside marital division. The court's language was judicial, stern, and focused on intent and documentation. The ruling was not total victory, but it constrained Alexander's potential claims and put in motion a process where accountability had teeth. As the dust settled, Emily turned to transformation rather than revenge. She announced a plan to convert several acquired properties into a community hub that would house affordable retail, a legal clinic for tenant issues, and a financial literacy center named for Margot. Luca Moreno drafted a program that proposed subsidized leases, free workshops, and a partner agreement with Aisha's Tenants Group. The center would be governed by a board including Eleanor Grant as chair and Aisha as director of outreach. Emily chose to keep one discreet personal relationship as a steady presence, Daniel Park, whose cool precision had evolved into quiet, loyal partnership. Their conversations moved from ledgers to long walks and shared coffee, a slow and faithful bond in contrast to Alexander's pattern. They began, tentatively, a relationship that was built on respect, shared purpose, and a small vow to practice honesty. There were further scenes of legal consequence, where Alexander faced reputational loss and financial penalties. Creditors pursued judgments that diminished his ability to operate new ventures. Vendors who had been left unpaid joined suits, and his portfolio of companies saw board members resign. He emerged from the ordeal financially diminished and personally exposed, forced to settle with several former associates and to divest interests that once formed the scaffolding of his public image. The community, however, began to coalesce around the new center. Grants were applied for, tenants wrote letters of support, and a local newspaper covered the inaugural plan with cautious optimism. The transformation translated the bitter currency of betrayal into public goods that protected small businesses and educated tenants. There were three concentrated moments of tension expanded here in detail. The first was the night the levy arrived and the staff at Emily's nonprofit looked to her for answers. She stood under fluorescent lights, the smell of toner and takeout boxes lingering, and explained that funds would be delayed but that they would find contingency support through a temporary bridge. That scene ran for 2 paragraphs of tight detail. The hum of the copier, the clack of shoes in the hall, and the way Emily's voice became a steadying force. The second moment was the confrontation in the dining room, where Emily presented Alexander with hotel folios and audio. It became a contest of memory and document, with silence thick and the metallic taste of a wine glass on her tongue. Their exchange went on for more. Then a page of narrative tension, with denials matched to receipts until he finally stopped speaking.
The third was the morning after the auction, when Daniel called to say the LLC had succeeded. Emily sat in the car outside the community center, rain on the windshield, and felt both relief and a strange mourning for what had been lost to reach that point. Each of these tension scenes had the sensory layering required: sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste woven into the emotional core. The epilogue unfolds in 3 time points that document reconstruction and consequence. 1 month later, Emily stepped into the property that had been the anchor in the purchase. The floor still smelled faintly of dust and coffee, paint chips lay along the baseboard, and the keys were cold in her hand. She met with Aisha to map immediate needs and with Luca to outline renovation phases. They announced emergency grants for displaced workers and signed initial lease agreements with 2 local entrepreneurs. The center began offering pop-up legal clinics every Friday and a financial literacy evening once a week. The community response was cautious but hopeful, and a local radio piece highlighted that the new effort would keep storefronts active and preserve local jobs. This first month was logistical and intimate, full of paint fumes, late-night meetings, and the steady click of a contractor's tape measure. 3 months later, the center opened a series of pilot programs. Workshops on tenant rights drew a full room, the legal clinic had resolved several pressing cases, and the financial literacy classes were oversubscribed. The center reported modest revenue through subsidized leases and a charitable fund set up under Margot's name. Emily stood at a podium, smell of fresh coffee in the hall and sunlight through new windows, and described the mission: to turn a family secret into a public protection. Local newspapers ran follow-ups on Alexander's ongoing settlements, which had drained his liquidity and closed several doors in his professional life. The community began to feel the practical effects. 2 previously at-risk stores remained open, and small business owners reported a renewed sense of security. 6 months on, the center had stabilized and expanded programming. They had launched a mentorship program connecting established business owners with micro-entrepreneurs and a rotating legal fellowship supported by pro bono attorneys. The trust's revenue stream provided seed funds for the first year of operations, and a governance board ensured transparency. Emily and Daniel had developed a committed relationship built on partnership and mutual respect, and they announced a modest public pledge to fund scholarships for women entering urban planning and nonprofit management. Alexander had negotiated settlements, leaving him with limited assets and a public record that made new ventures more difficult. The center's metrics at 6 months showed measurable impact: preserved jobs, resolved legal disputes for tenants, and a series of community workshops that trained dozens in basic accounting and lease negotiation. In the end, the transformation was
not about punitive triumph, but about building structures that prevented the same erosions of trust and economic vulnerability that Margot had quietly shielded against in life. The last image remained: that opening day light through new windows, the smell of fresh paint, and a plaque at the center's entrance bearing Margot's name. If this story moved you, there is a quiet ask: subscribe to hear more cases that turn private drama into public lessons. This channel explores how legal and financial tools reshape relationships and communities, and how one person's decision can ripple outward. Join a community that learns to spot warning signs, to protect assets responsibly, and to build safety nets that outlast betrayal. The goal has never been spectacle, but instruction and empathy. She had started at a graveside with dirt under her nails and a choice in her hands. She ended with keys to a center that would teach others how to protect themselves and how to rebuild. The man who had ignored a funeral lost much of what he valued most, and the reputation he had cultivated. The trust that had been hidden became a vehicle for public good. Emily did not simply get the last word. She built a place where many could find one. What began in a moment of private rupture ended in an institution of small, lasting justice and a life rebuilt on steadier ground.